Hello and welcome to this Denim Group webinar. I'm your host, Nam Palmero. During the presentation, all participants will be in listen-only mode, and we ask that you mute your phones. Following the presentation, we will conduct a question and answer session. At that time, if you have a question, please use the chat feature. As a reminder, this conference is being recorded. Following the webcast, you will receive a follow-up email containing a link to the video replay and to the white paper. Today's speaker, John Dixon, is an internationally recognized security leader, entrepreneur, and principal at Denim Group. He has nearly 20 years hands-on experience in intrusion detection, network security, and application security in the commercial, public, and military sectors. As a Denim Group principal, he helps executives and CSOs of Fortune 500 companies and government organizations launch and expand their critical application security initiatives. I would now like to turn it over to John for the presentation.
Thanks a bunch, Nan. Welcome, everybody. I appreciate everyone taking time out of their busy holiday schedule to sit through a webinar. This is probably our last big event before many of us on this end take off a couple weeks for the holidays. So I hope I've got you as a captive audience and look forward to the next 20 to 30 minutes together. This particular presentation, this deck, is based on an entire body of work and thought around driving security, application security programs in large companies. Specifically, there's an assumption here that that most of the hardest things about driving a program around software security are not technical. And the bulk of work, the body of work that you see in application security is technical in nature, and it maybe has to do with the SDLCs. And this is an acknowledgement and a departure from that, an acknowledgement that much of the factors of success in large companies are outside that realm and involve much more softer skills, or what I like to call organizational behavior and design skills. The ability for somebody to use informal power, informal influence to get the job done on their behalf. The other assumption here is that in most large companies, there's a handful of people that worry about software risk and the security of apps. They're a much larger development team or teams, a developer force that has to be influenced. So think of 5 or 6, 7 people versus 2,000 developers, which is not a mismatch. So that's where we're coming from. Look forward to getting started here. My particular background is, as Nan said, I spend most of my time as a trusted advisor to security leaders around these programmatic issues in application security. We've got a whole host of colleagues that I work with that are testers and architects, but that's kind of the niche that I've carved out within the company and spend most of my time helping security leaders really cut new ground or to make progress outside of their security groups with the business units. I'm an ISSA Distinguished Fellow, ex-Air Force person. I do a bit of speaking, and I write a regular piece and column in Dark Reading for those that follow. So that's my background. This is what I do for a living, and I assume most of the people on this call, given the nature of the topic, have similar backgrounds. They're probably very technical, very experienced, and probably know their way around the application security world. So I will do a deep dive on terms and acronyms here and there. I'm assuming that most people on this call have that similar background. If not, you can always message me or email me or ask after the session. Denim Group, for those, many of the people on the call know who we are. For those that are not, we're a professional services firm, about 100 folks that focus on the security of software. We, in addition to doing testing and SDLC work, actually do a bit of secure development as well and remediation. So we touch code, and we have a particular bedside manner that our clients appreciate as we help them post-scan fix vulnerabilities. We also are the developer of ThreatFix, the enterprise application security remediation platform that we sell, and that's us. So we're very deeply ingrained in our clients' processes for software development, software security, and this session reflects that. So let me get into the specifics right off the bat. So again, I talked about some of the assumptions going in, the assumptions being specifically that Most of the successful software security initiatives are less technical driven, but they have a tremendous amount of organizational influence that are components. And one of the advantages that we have as a consultant is that we see a whole portfolio of clients. So what this particular presentation and session reflects are what we see as common denominators, common factors in the successful programs. If you look back and say, hey, we see client A, B, and C, what are the things that they all did or did well, and this is what we have distilled into this particular presentation. We'll send it out after today's session, but I've also written a white paper that goes further into the topic for those that are thus inclined. But so there's some basic overview assumptions here that very similar to any other IT or development project. Honestly, an application security initiative, software security initiative, whatever you want to call it, should have a phased approach. We'll talk about in the five different stages or aspects. But you'll find that you need to get essentially successes and footholds and when you do a rollout, because essentially you will use those and leverage those success stories to, for lack of a better term, shame other development teams into doing better. And one of the things we've learned over the last several years is that developers may not fully understand the security ramifications of what they do, but they don't want to be bad developers. They don't want to stink. And so if you can somehow convince them to include security as part of the quality coding effort, then you're having success. So very much like any other project, you want to do some type of test or some type of beta before you go. And in most companies, they have multiple development teams. So we'll talk about that. You've really got to focus on getting some quick wins on one of the two of the development teams and then rolling it out. The other assumption here is that essentially WAFs and automated scanners do not equate to a full application security program. They're incredibly important. WAFs, automated scanners, I'd throw in now RASP technologies for those that are familiar with real-time application security protection. Let's just say automation and tools have a critical role. And our view of the world is you want to get as much under automation as you possibly can, but recognize that you've got to address the gaps. And this is part of the addressing the gaps process. So the other thing that you've got to focus on is if you really want to fix the SDLC, to fix security, you've got to address process improvement. You also have to address business logic flaws and authorization vulnerabilities. Specifically, those are ones that this automated technologies don't pick up. We'll go through how we address that in this session, but that is really where success is, where we don't have the big architectural gaps. So before I go into the first phase of what we do and recommend and what we see everywhere, why is this important? I should have maybe hit you with that before we got started. But why is this important? Obviously for those that are in regulated industries, specifically, if you're in a compliance framework like the data security standards for the PCI world, you're going to have that baked into the into compliance frameworks, PCI DSS being specifically. If you're a bank, you're going to have this as part of your FFIEC annual audit visits, the auditors coming in. But what we see happening over and over throughout the U.S. in multiple industries is buyers, the big buyers of the world, now making software security requirements part of their acquisition for their suppliers. We saw it originally in the retail world with the Walmarts and Targets of the world pushing that down. We were in Houston last week, and we caught that from multiple clients there, that the real big guys, the Shells and BPs of the world, are starting to push down security requirements around software to their vendors. So it's starting to change the world. So let's talk about this. Let's go back to the first step, obviously, in any software security initiative is to characterize the landscape. What does that mean? I mean, you have to have a deep understanding of where you're going to get wins, how you're going to adjust your strategy, where you're going to put your limited resources and manpower. And so the first thing you have to do is really have a fundamental understanding of the compliance framework. I said compliance regulation. What are the external rules and regulations that are driving behaviors within your company? Again, on one end of the spectrum are the banks, and the other end, you've got companies that have very little, privately held companies that have little external regulation. But you have to understand what those are because you may invoke them. You may say, well, we have to do this because buyer A wants this, or excuse me, regulator A needs this, or, in order to process credit cards at this level, we have to have this particular thing. That is important for starting purposes because what we've learned as a vendor is people are motivated to do things when they're forced to many times. So that's the strongest card you have is not a discretionary thing. You have to do something. That's compliance driven. The second thing I would say is analyze and understand the cultural norms. Culture drives most organizations. You never confuse Apple with Microsoft with General Electric. They're very, very different. And you're going to have to adapt and adjust not only to the way that they learn and the way they change things. Are they a top-down culture? Are they, do they essentially roll their own, and do they have every dev team and dev methodology on the planet? You're going to have to understand the cultural norm if you come in and take over because what you're going to adapt and adjust is driven off of that. There's certain organizations that are compliance-driven. You can invoke internal audit to come and say, well, you've got to do this because internal audit says. So understanding the cultural norms, understanding how change happens within the organizations. Is it top-down? Is it organic? Do they have a focus on safety? We had one client who invoked safety because they were a safety-driven organization, and they put security under the cloak of safety, saying, look, this could happen on some of our sites if we have bad coding. So adapting and adjusting to the cultural norms is important. Understand what current SDLCs are in place. I use the SDLCs as in plural. We see in most complex and large organizations multiple teams, multiple technology stacks, multiple dev and SDLC processes, and security testing that reflects that. I mean, all over the place. And so you're going to have to pick your battles and figure out where you're going to try to get your first win from. And it may be a place that is, or a team that is has to do federal work and has to do some type of compliance around federal stuff. We've seen that happen. Or maybe they have a development leader who is particularly, it came from, a bank or something. We've seen that happen too, where you got to have somebody quote unquote gets it. That hey, I came from MasterCard or American Express, and now I'm here. That those are all important things because you're essentially trying to change culture as teams develop software. The fourth thing we do is identify and kind of do I use a consulting term, do a gap analysis of what they've already implemented. Don't assume they've not done a thing, but you probably have dynamic scanners over here, you probably have external pen test over there, maybe they took some training. Figure out what they've already done. Don't assume they've done nothing, but also, you may find pockets of excellence. You may have teams that have gotten it. You may already have a win in place that you can turn around and say, look at these guys, what they're doing. The last thing is don't take any of that on face value. Recognize the gap between what they're saying and what they're doing. We've seen companies say, oh, we did training for all of our developers, and we come to find out it was 3 years ago, and they subsequently have started to do mobile dev. They switched dev platforms to doing Java instead of .NET. I mean, or they bought a dynamic scanner and they're running it without credentials. We've seen that too, where somebody bought, Acunetics, and they were doing kind of surface level scanning, or they went and bought HP or IBM's dynamic scanners, and they just they weren't running them or they weren't running them well, and they weren't validating the results or doing anything beyond that. So that's the last thing. So first of all, you figured out kind of the good, the bad, and the ugly. Where are you going to focus your limited resources? The second step is and this is a conscious thing that we've seen people be successful have to do. You have to secure champions. And you have to confirm executive support. If you don't have the CIO, it's an uphill battle. About half the CISOs report to CIOs, so that's the first thing that you have to do. But I'm assuming you've got some executive support within the IT or security organization. The bridge that you have to cross typically is getting the business unit buy-in or non-technical folks. So that's where, invoke internal audit. Sometimes they get that part because you have to listen to an internal audit in certain regulated industries. That's a weapon you can use, or a tool, whatever way you want to look at it. But what we've found is once you've kind of cataloged the teams, and figure out where dev is happening, that's maybe a bigger process than I'm giving credit. But let's say you figured out you have 120 teams in 17 different locations. The next thing you have to do is to secure a focal point in that organization. What we've seen best is make it a volunteer additional duty, and you recognize the folks that have contributed and have raised their hand and said, yes, I'm interested in doing this. What we've found successful companies do, for example, is to use lunch and learns, to go around under the name of building awareness and, in launching some type of software security initiative. They've actually gone out and, done these lunch and learns, and invariably there's somebody in the room that took 2 electives in their CS program around security, or they came from a bank or someplace, or worked at NSA, and they're the ones that are all fired up about it. Those are your natural internal champions, so that you have to catalog those. You essentially have to deputize them to do on your behalf what you'll never, ever be able to do on your own. I mean, again, think of 7 versus 2,000 or 5 versus 1,500. You're never going to be at every meeting, and you need that person to be either the formalized or informal champion to, during the design meetings, to raise their hand and say, well, wait a second, why are we doing this? To think a little bit more from an attack side perspective, and a little bit more abuse case-driven development. There's a whole ton more. We could talk about this, but in the interest of time, I would say leveraging your resources, deputizing internal champions on the dev teams is an absolute must. Absent of it, you're just on the outside looking in. So after you've done all those things, you've essentially characterized the landscape, you've got champions in place. The next thing is to define strategy and standards based upon culture, based upon the regulatory or compliance environment. All this stuff should be a no-brainer to most people on the call. We think what we've really been focused on lately is coverage. And so when we talk about coverage is, are you really looking at all your apps? So identifying the most vulnerable applications to show people, but also ranking from least critical to most critical, and devoting the limited resources to the critical apps, and making sure everything else is being scanned, maybe just automatically for automated scanners, some time basis that reflects your risk appetite. Doing a deep dive on the critical applications. I mean, because here's the other thing: at this point in the program, we see that many developers still believe that these kind of problems happen to other people. So you have to make it real and almost personal, and show the dev teams without shaming them, but just say, look, this is what we found. We found all these different things. Yes, this is how it manifested itself. I mean, we have this kind of disbelief phase that we deal with new clients. They just simply believe that this would not happen to them. And so that's part of it. You have to show examples. They have to be personalized. Make sure you've got the entire portfolio covered, because you're really worried about your attack profile, your attack space on apps. You can't, spend all these resources testing deeply the website or web applications when you've ignored mobile, or you find out that there's other, a business unit has web-facing third-party apps, supply chain apps or something. That's part of your attack profile. So define standards for future improvement. I mean, our kind of recommendation is to set modest goals and try to achieve them. So don't be too ambitious. It's all reflective of culture, and it's all, you don't want to be best in class or best practices. You want to be, you want to do what, essentially your level of what your peers are doing, and that's wildly different between sectors. So things that we've seen that have been successful examples of that are, half-day class overviews, publishing a top 10 coding standards. I love that one, where if it can fit on a 3x5 card, it might actually be looked at by the developers. If you send them a policy or compliance document, it will be summarily ignored. So we were with a client 2 weeks ago. I said, take your 5-page policy standards, boil it down into a handful of things that are important to you from the dev standpoint, and make that as simple as possible for them. For example, we handle customer data this way all the time. We test mobile apps every major release. And, it's kind of a top 10 or a top 10 commandments, whatever you want to call it, but something where that they can look at. Implement threat modeling. Realistically, that is something that we recommend for at the design phases of an application for the most critical and the new functionality. That doesn't happen nearly as often as it should, and making it consistent is important. So threat modeling is important. Building a consistent apples-to-apples threat modeling program is tough to do. We, again, recommend modesty, or I should say a modest approach to that, not a Baroque or entirely complex flow, because you'll simply have it implemented so many different ways. So defining a standard, defining frequency of testing, defining of risk of what you can accept. This is where, like, the Netflixes of the world, who are really pushing to get first to market on different features and functionalities, they're willing to put live apps and live functionality out, but they have a mechanism to identify if there's vulnerabilities in their live environments and to tear those vulnerabilities down. So that's one end versus like NASA doing CMMI development and all that. It's all important, and defining the standards is just so important, because you have to be able to show successes to the business units. So the next phase is actually to execute the initiative. You need to empower the champions. You need to include them in a plan. This is where maybe you've made one pass. You need to then figure out what is the level and frequency of the testing that you do. What is if they add new functionality. We've seen people use internal wikis or blogs, meetups, Google Meetups, Hangouts. I mean, any way to informally communicate. But and we've seen organizations reward informally or recognize these guys and gals that are doing this. Again, so empowering them, keeping them appraised after you've done your first sets of maybe scans, and then figuring out where they can add additional value. So that is an important one. Tailor to your audience. Again, we talked about culture. I would define culture down to the teams and to the actual business units. So, and you have to tailor it as such. So what I mean by that is, if you have the dev team that is, doing 1,000,000 miles an hour to get new product out, and they're doing extreme programming, and you have to tailor what you're doing, both in tactics, but also in where you're going to inject yourself. You may have to wait until they get their product out and go back after the fact. What we're talking about here is, where do you drop in modest controls or modest steps? We had a client that has, a team doing BIOS development. Where do you start? I mean, none of the technologies, application scanners work on BIOS, none that I'm aware of. Correct me if I'm wrong there, but it's a unique approach to that team. What you've done in web stuff is less relevant to the mobile guys who are putting a build out a day. How do you tailor what you're doing to the audience and to the teams and technologies? So the next thing that we really push is to essentially define a modest set of success metrics, and then measure those and measure your program to that success. I'll give you examples of ones that we see. Again, windows of vulnerability, mean time to remediate. How long does it take to fix an application after you've identified the vulnerability? How many vulnerabilities per line of code? what are the frequency of highs and criticals versus lows and medians? Are we trending better or are we trending worse? All those things are exceedingly important because you're ultimately wanting to compare the development teams to each other. So this is a key point. The reason you have metrics is so you can chart improvement, you can go to the CFO and say, this is important, we're doing better or we're doing worse. And so you can let the development team see how they're doing relative to each other. And again, development teams don't want to stink. They don't want to be the bad guys or the dumb guys, right? So we see a bit of gamification being injected here, where that's where you kind of show the teams they're doing well and you champion them. You don't shame the guys that are doing poorly. You just make it abundantly apparent that doing good programming includes having an absence of security flaws or coding defects around security. So setting metrics is set success because you want to be able to ultimately go back to the business units who are probably paying for what you do, or the CFO, and say, look, this is what we did. We've lowered risk, we think, by X amount. And I would say making statements like that are like doing pro forma cash flow statements. It's not, you're kind of predicting or making an argument. We think we've improved by this much. Here's the numbers that we have to reflect that. The absence of hopefully breaches is another good one. But these are hard to do, but you've got to do it because, again, you are taking precious resources away from the business. Somebody in your organization is painfully aware of how much they're spending on your activity. You've got to, either quantify what you're doing by lowering risk, or you need to be able to, continue to show them that you've kept them out of the news. So some key thoughts throughout this process: show quick wins. That's why I'm saying if there's some low-hanging dev teams that you can get in front of to do this stuff first, that maybe you have a personal relationship with, maybe their dev manager gets it. Those are way better to work on than, a remote team that is just has no idea what you want to do, and they're, politically they're resistant to external teams, telling them what to do. So that's an important one. That's back to, the characterizing the landscape. Then you want to highlight those positive behaviors, those wins, and you want to do that in a very public way. The more public, the better, and that's where you can invoke the CIO and the business unit folks. Ultimately, where you want to get is you want to get to the point where the business units folks come to you and say, hey, look, we're considering rolling out this new cloud-based application, or we're considering introducing a product in Asia. What are the risks associated with that? You want to be kind of the consultant around system and software risk at the highest level. And why that's so important is you get asked those questions, you get further and further upriver from vulnerabilities being created. So the higher value conversations you're having with dev leadership and dev management, the more likely you are to prevent bad behaviors around coding, and then again, accidental, inadvertent, but bad behaviors that you then have to do triage on later. So you're really essentially trying to get others to do on your behalf what you know is important, and you're trying to get them to do it when you're not in the room. Again, the real challenge here is in most organizations, the people that worry about software risk are security folks, and many, if not most of them, are network security people. The folks that can do the most about that problem, that risk, are developers on development teams who have features and functionality always as trump cards to invoke. So keep that in mind as you go through. If you can get developers to essentially turn around and view security as an additional facet of quality, then you've been successful. Okay, so the last session is to sustain the program, and this is where the the initiatives sometimes falter after a year or two, or they lose personalities. But I mean, ultimately, you want coverage, and you want coverage, scanning coverage. You want to be consultant when you have new projects come online or products come online. you want to be considered as part of the, essentially development program at the earliest and most conceptual stages. So the thing you have to do, in addition to keeping the trains running on time, figuring out and tuning and fine-tuning your scanning and your testing program, is to monitor the regulatory environment, because things change dramatically. I mean, we just saw, really in the last few weeks, some requirements have come out about SCADA and control system development and being pushed by some of the very large oil companies. I mean, that's changing the way that, certain companies are reacting. When the PCI, payment card industry, PCI changes its data security standards, and there's a 2.0, well, that's changed. So you've got to have somebody, either a relationship with the internal audit or somebody there that you can talk to that will make you aware of, strong changes, because you can either invoke them or you may have to change the way you do stuff. Identify new tools to improve software security. I mean, I've mentioned some of those early in the call. Obviously, there are new and exciting ways, new technologies that come out all the time. I'll give you a great example. Testing software libraries. That was conceptually an issue a few years back, but that's become front and center, more important. Using real-time protections is another example. Of tools, you have to keep really an eye on those things, because you can fix it, potentially faster, quicker, and at less cost. So, obviously, having many different ways to skin the cat is really good. Observe new risks within the organization. I said SaaS or cloud platforms. I mean, one of the attributes about cloud computing is the buyer is almost always not the CIO or the IT organization. Salesforce.com is consumed and bought by the sales organization. A lot of times you'll hear these companies are informed of a cloud decision. And by the way, cloud decisions almost always are a cost savings component. So you're never going to be able to fight that battle, because you're saving money, making it easier. So how do you onboard those? How do you get invited to ask some of these risk questions? And by the way, software lives in different places, including outside the organization. What kind of questions do you want to ask, and how do you observe new risk? Mobile, great example. How does mobile change things, and mobile and web services that service the mobile apps that you have out there? How does that work? I would just say the landscape and the attack surface has changed immensely in the last 2 to 3 years, 4 years, 10 years. But so keep one eye outside the organization and one inside the organization. I mean, throw in new dev platforms. I mean, that's the other thing, is you've got these new dynamic languages that seem to come out all the time. You've got to be able to address and figure out, like, well, where do we inject security stuff? So that's the last major part of a program. Again, these are all attributes of things that we've seen in varying organizations as that we noticed over time, said, okay, these are things they do well. We observe that, and the 5 separate different areas are really ways that we've characterized and looked at the world. So I want to wrap up and leave enough time for questions and answers. So handful of things. Enterprise-wide initiative is really not a technical activity. It's one of organizational behavior. It's using informal influence and power, and fortunately, unfortunately, it is more a sales and marketing activity. If you're one of the 5 or 7 or so AppSec people trying to influence thousands of developers, that is a fundamentally different job than what you were brought on to be, and probably different than your background, if you like everything. You're re-engineering a system in flight. I mean, you're trying to ask them to do something different, do it better, do things on your behalf that they probably should be doing, but they don't have the time to do. Doing it in a disciplined and tailored approach is very important. Being able to capture successes and to repeat it over and over again. And again, follow the strategy that you defined and tailor it to the organization, or I'd say even more specifically, tailor it to the different dev teams based on culture. And with that, I've got time for questions and answers. In the follow-up email that we'll send all the people that attended, we'll send you the link for the white paper. For everybody on the call, I'd love your feedback on it. We have a lot of people that downloaded it. It's rare that I get feedback. So I love that, and I have no pride in authorship, but I really just think this is something, after 10 years in OWASP and 10 years of doing stuff in the industry, this is an area that is a weak spot for many. So with that, I guess we got some questions and answers. So the first question we have, let me read that one, was if you don't have the CIO, if you don't have the CIO support, or you don't have somebody from the CIO organization that is supportive, what do you do? Okay, so if you don't have somebody from the CIO organization that is behind you, that's going to be an uphill battle. That's where hopefully you have a Chief Information Security Officer, or CSO, wherever that person fits within the organization. You've got to invoke that person. I put it this way. I'm assuming that you have the CIO supportive, you have the CISO or CSO supportive. Most of where we see challenges are the business units outside the technology group or outside the risk or security group. So that's my assumption. So what would you do? You'd have to invoke those, maybe invoke internal audit, as I gave you some background, or maybe a good old penetration test sometimes is something that people that's what people do sometimes to get folks' attention. What should you do if your peers don't believe your organization could be a target? Okay, so this is a little bit of a challenge where if you're talking to your development brethren and they don't think it could happen to them, that's again kind of good where you do a pen test and you show them it can happen to them. What we have seen is an increasing use of what are called the Information Sharing and Analysis Centers, the ISACs, that are industry driven. Sometimes you can get numbers from them. Sometimes you can get breach stories that happen in companies that are like yours. That's an example of something we've seen. But what we have done also for classroom training from a vendor standpoint is we have actually been able to use applications from the client side to make it real. So if they don't believe it, it's like, well, let's go look at your application right here. So again, it's this kind of this issue where people don't believe it could happen to them. That's a little bit of a challenge. Okay. Are there any other quick hacks to convince people that they should engage in the security program that didn't get mentioned in the presentation? I would say, going back to some of the fun ideas that I've seen people use is, again, making a program fun and interesting. I've seen people use guerrilla marketing techniques where they go into the conference rooms on the dev floors and write little things and little notes about security. I think it's the guys at Adobe have a security ninja program to recognize different levels, of smartness or of security awareness of the guys have gone. So I've seen all kinds of little guerrilla marketing techniques to do that. I think the recognition part. The other one I've seen is give things away. I mean, we did a application security training survey about 2 years ago, and we had a difficult time getting respondents from many members of the development staff. And what we ended up doing is I think we put like a $50 Amazon card or Apple card or whatever, and next thing you know, like everybody filled stuff out. So that's another little hack you can do if you want to get people's attention to attend the lunch and learns, is to have something in play like that. And I'm telling you, these guys get paid a lot of money. They're senior people and very, very smart, but they're not immune to a gift card. I'll just leave it at that. So it looks like that was our final question. And with that, I'm going to wrap up and after this particular one and just say that's me on Twitter. You can DM me, follow me, whatever, or email me at john@dinnergroup.com. But if you have more questions, I encourage you to read the white paper and give me feedback. But I appreciate your time. I appreciate everybody sitting through this call, and I look forward to hearing from you. Have a happy holidays.